We're back at the Unstereotype Alliance Global Member Summit 2021, and we're following the sun around each of our national chapters before landing back in New York on Wednesday morning. And now we're about to be welcomed by Unstereotype Alliance United Arab Emirates to talk about the need for gender equality in the MENA region and in the workplace.
Good morning and a warm welcome to an invigorating introduction to the UAE chapter of the Unstereotype Alliance. My name is Priya Sarma. I'm the Senior Sustainability and Corporate Affairs Manager for Unilever in the Middle East, and also a board member of the Advertising Business Group, which is the region's self-regulatory advertising and marketing group, and an ally to the Unstereotype Alliance. Now, formed less than 6 months ago in November 2020, the 7 founding members of the UAE chapter of the Unstereotype Alliance came together with the aim to help shape the narrative with regards to how Middle East society and culture values women, and more importantly, how women and girls really view themselves. And we aim to do so using the power of advertising, which holds great influence on the way genders are portrayed in society, because while advertising reflects culture, it also helps shape societal norms. Now, while stereotypes in advertising have been an area of focus globally for the past few years, in the MENA region, this is a relatively new area of discussion and interest. And it is well acknowledged that prevalent gender stereotypes among men and women, girls and boys are fundamentally blocking progress towards equality. Additionally, we have a long way to go to achieve gender balance across all of our sectors. Arab women have generally been slow to enter the formal labor force across the MENA region over the last 50 years, despite very high rates of enrollment and educational literacy levels, because they do face significant cultural and institutional setbacks. So as a newly formed chapter, our ambitions are large, where we want to prioritize and take action to close the gender gap to make a real impact. Now, in order to explain further the basis of why we founded the UAE chapter of the United Arab Emirates, I would now like to hand over to Dr. Ganga Dhanesh, who is the Associate Professor and Associate Dean, College of Communications and Media Sciences at the Zayed University, and Dr. Ali Khalil, Assistant Professor, College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University, who will present to you a presentation that's titled Mirror versus Mold, Analysis of Gender Stereotyping in Advertising in the GCC. This research really aims to present the gender portrayals in TV ads in the Gulf, and like I mentioned earlier, was very important and really set the basis for us to actually launch the UAE chapter of the Unstereotype Alliance. So Ganga and Dr. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Priya. I'm delighted and honored to be sharing our research on gender stereotyping in advertising in the GCC, very aptly titled Mirror versus Mold. This study was published in a special issue on women in marketing in the peer-reviewed international journal Business Horizons. It's also available in the online store of Harvard Business Review as a partner article. So let's get started. So what is gender stereotyping and why is it important? Gender stereotyping refers to personal beliefs that certain attributes differentiate men and women, such as physical characteristics. People could say men are generally taller than women, or roles that women are homemakers and men are providers, or activity preferences that women like to shop while men like to do sports, or even personality traits that men are independent and women are dependent. Now, although stereotypes are not necessarily negative in and of themselves, they become deeply problematic when they reduce this wide range of differences amongst people to very simplistic categories, which can have pretty negative consequences, particularly for women. For example, gender stereotypes related to math can actually undermine girls' and women's interest in STEM domains, or a mismatch of stereotypes such as women are warm and communal, whereas leaders are assertive and competent, can lead to negative attitudes towards women leaders. It can cause body dissatisfaction, and reduce self-confidence. In fact, whenever I think of gender stereotyping and its harmful consequences, I'm reminded of training baby elephants. You see, to domesticate elephants when they're very young, they're often chained to a tree with this heavy chain. When they move, they're restricted by this chain, and the chain kind of reminds them of the range of what they can do and what they cannot do. When they grow up and they become these majestic, gigantic beasts, the heavy chain is not even needed. Just a light rope will do, because by then, these barriers have been instilled, ingrained, literally imprinted in their minds. In the case of gender stereotyping and what can be and cannot be done, barriers are further propagated and reinforced in commercial storytelling, in advertising, in the movies that we make, in the stories that we tell. Advertising research frames gender stereotyping within what has been called the mirror versus the mold argument, arguing on the one hand that advertising merely mirrors society. We are just a reflection of what's going on in society. While on the other hand, it argues that advertising can be very powerful. It can mold societal attitudes and behavior. Let's just take an example. The ad by Nike Middle East, "What Will They Say About You?" featuring 5 well-known women athletes from the Middle East, is a classic example of the mold argument. If you have seen this ad, the clip opens with a woman running in a hijab as people, just pedestrians standing along the roadside, they stare at her. The ad then shows women athletes skateboarding, fencing, boxing, ice skating, while the narrator says in the background, "What will they say about you?" "What will they say about you" is a classic refrain that most girls and young women face in typically collectivistic patriarchal societies, embodying societal pressure as they try to pursue those interests that are close to their heart. "What will they say about you" becomes the rope on their feet. By answering, "Maybe they'll say you exceeded all expectations," Nike is not merely mirroring, but trying to mold societal attitudes towards women pursuing their passion for sports. Now, interestingly, recent reviews of around 75, 80 studies across the world on gender stereotyping in advertising has shown that gender stereotyping has decreased over the years. These studies argue that advertising is starting to mirror changes in society because of the changing roles of men and women, both in the family and in the workforce. However, most of this research has been conducted outside of this region, in the US and elsewhere. What is the situation in the UAE and in the GCC? GCC countries are mostly conservative Muslim nations that are deeply patriarchal. However, countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have committed deep resources to empowering women. The UAE set up a Gender Balance Council in 2015 to strengthen the role of Emirati women in society. In 2020, the UAE introduced a law that ensures equal pay for men and women in the private sector. In response, women have been literally soaring high, with Emirati women pilots now navigating A380s at Etihad Airways, and women leading in STEM, with the Ministry of State for Advanced Technology and chairwoman of the UAE Space Agency, Sara Al-Amiri, instrumental in leading the UAE mission to Mars. Just one of a few examples. Finally, the Arab region has an overwhelmingly young population, with at least 65% under the age of 30. The Arab Youth Survey has shown that the concerns of this demographic mirror those of youth in most parts of the world. They want to build families and have careers, both men and women. All these trends demand a response from marketers and advertisers, who have to stay in sync with these emerging trends in society. Although some governments in the region have been attempting to address issues of gender equity and women and youth have been responding positively, the question is, how have brands responded to these growing trends, especially in their depictions of gender roles in advertising? Recent research in corporate social responsibility shows that consumers, particularly millennials, the largest growing segment in the workforce today, want companies to do more. They care for companies that care. It's no longer about just providing great products and services. It is about companies taking a stand on ethical and social issues that matter, issues that are meaningful to the times that we live in. So how are companies in the region stepping up on issues of equity and gender representation? Is the GCC ad industry portraying the increasingly progressive role of women in the region, or does it continue to perpetuate traditional stereotypes? These were some of the questions that the ABG posed to us to do research on. Now I'll hand over to my colleague Ali Khalil to share the findings of the study on gender portrayal in TV ads in the GCC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ganga, and I'm really delighted to be here to share the results of our study. So to answer this question concerning the gender portrayal in the GCC, we actually conducted a content analysis of TV adverts, and we collected the ads over a period of 1 week. From a regional television channel, MBC1, and we basically went and looked into these adverts, into the way men and women are depicted through the portrayal of the main character in these adverts. In doing so, we built on studies that have been conducted elsewhere before to assess the gender portrayal on television. We've used variables and to do the classification and the coding for this portrayal. So I'll be sharing some of these variables that we used and the results for those. So first of all, we looked at the role of the central figure in the ad. So be it a man or a woman, how are they depicted? What are they doing? Are they in a familial role or a non-familial role? We also looked at the location where this central figure in the ad is. Are they at home or at work in an occupational setting? We also looked at the association between the product type and the gender of the main character. Are they promoting home products? Are they promoting food or other sorts of products? We also looked at the background. Who's around the main character? Concerning the results, the first category that I would like to share is the gender of the main character versus the product type. And we've noticed that basically in the product, home product, more than 85% of these products, the adverts for these products had a female main character. Also in the category for food products, almost 3/4 of those adverts had a female main character. When you in the home product, we're talking about detergents and washing powder and the like. We're not talking about appliances here. So one could argue that we can see typical stereotyping in this area. In the second variable that we used, the background, again, if we look at the statistics, so when it comes to the central figure having children in the background. In the case of men, very few had children in the background. While if we look at that figure for female main characters, it was quite significant. So again, that could reflect in a way the presence of children in the background, and it reflects again the caring role of the main character, and that's mostly also in the case of women. In the third variable, in the category of the location, out of all men that were portrayed in adverts within that week, basically almost 50% were at work in an occupational setting, while less than 10% were at home. This figure for women at home, of course, hits 60%. So if we also look at the figures from a different angle, if we look at adverts that were set at home, the at-home setting, 95% of these ads had female central figures. On the other hand, and probably a positive sign, if we look at adverts that were in an occupational setting, showing the central figure at an occupational setting, women were just less than half. So in this area, we saw a sign of a progressive attitude in a way, and probably, let's say, a sign of hope. In the fourth category, concerning the role of the main character, and this is looking at the character being in a familial role or non-familial role. Again, in the case of men depicted as the main characters in the adverts, 87% were in non-familial roles. Again, a small number appeared in a familial role, so being the father, being the husband, mostly away from familial roles. In the case of female central figures, it was different. It was almost balanced with women almost half in doing familial roles, and also around half in non-familiar roles. These range from being at work to anything else that does not involve to providing care for the family. So, if just looking at the results, we can tell that basically traditional gender portrayal, gender stereotyping is still prevalent in advertising in the region. There are some signs of hope that we've seen in a couple of categories, but it is obvious that action is needed, and this action has to come in the form of diversifying gender portrayals. Now, some might argue that those portrayals are just mirroring the society. These are actual. This is the reality. But here we can also argue, go back to the point: is it the job of advertising to just mirror the society, or actually try to mold the societal attitude by pushing forward with more balanced, more modern gender depictions? Again, this is more important when we do bear in mind that a significant proportion of the population in the region are young, and we need to bear in mind their aspirations. Also, to consider that most governments have embraced women empowerment, and also to realize and to acknowledge that women are indeed active members of the workforce in most of these countries. Although advertising represents content that aims to sell. We believe that there is a role to be played in choosing to challenge stereotypes and lead for change. Advertising should avoid emphasizing that certain roles are the exclusive domains of certain genders. And obviously, to end with, guidelines within the industry are very, very important in this regard. These guidelines setting the parameters maybe to make sure that traditional stereotypes, gender stereotyping are being eliminated and more balanced gender portrayal is presented to the viewers.
Thank you, Ali and Ganga, and I think you're absolutely right. I think that the industry needs to play a role in generating, understanding the nuances of the narratives that we show in our brand building and our advertising, and therefore put forth guidelines that help guide advertisers and marketers in how to change the narrative or mold the narrative to be more gender neutral as well as less stereotypical. I'm Deepa Vaidyanathan. I am the Senior Director of Gender Equality and Sustainability for Procter & Gamble for this region. I'm also a member of the Advertising Business Group and the board of ABG. And today I'd like to talk to you about some of the work that we've pulled together to pull together guidelines for appropriate portrayal of gender in advertising and marketing communication in UAE. These guidelines were actually created by a group of us representing different industries. So there was JWT, so we had Sally from JWT, Noura from Weber Shandwick, Priya, who you saw earlier from Unilever, Nahil from Bystorf, and myself from Procter & Gamble that pulled together these guidelines for appropriate portrayal of gender in advertising and marketing communication in UAE. Our vision really was to think about the role that we can play as advertisers and marketers in being a force for good in advancing gender equality and women empowerment in UAE. The intention really is to address some of the many biases that exist in our region and across the world as well, and ensure that via the scenarios that we are depicting through our communication, we avoid reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Our intention as an industry association is to be a key driver of cultural change, ensuring that we are inspiring gender equality, but at the same time, keeping in mind some of the cultural traditions and balancing that out by being progressive in the UAE. The other is to ensure, and we kind of deployed these guidelines approximately a year ago to help influence people who are actually creating advertising narratives to ensure that we are influencing and reducing any gender stereotypes that might exist in our communication that, say, Ali spoke about a little bit earlier today. And the other is we really want to celebrate new age UAE advertising that actually shows people or shows genders that are non-conforming to gender stereotypes. These were the themes that as we kind of worked together to look at the different pieces of advertising communication that were there in the UAE, we recognized that there were three areas that we needed to focus on. We needed to focus on stereotypical roles, like what a man does and what a woman does, that's considered stereotypical, characteristics, and they can range everything from, right from everything from abilities to a certain kind of sensibility, which are stereotypical, so characteristics. And then the third was around appearance, right? There's a certain specific kind of appearance that's considered positive, and there's a certain stereotypical appearance that's considered negative from a gender point of view. And then the last is we also try to double click on specific vulnerable groups, that is particular groups, especially life stages where the stereotypes increase the pressure to conform. And then the last is we recognize that some of this molding and the mirroring of and the creation of this narrative actually starts very early. It starts as when you're kids. So then what is the role that we can play as an industry to help provide guidelines of how to feature children in advertising and marketing communication. Good. So the first one that we wanted to talk about was the one about reinforcing that particular roles are only the responsibility of a specific gender. Now, what do we mean by this? You'll notice that across these guidelines, we have underlined specific guidelines, and that's really the nuance in it. So for example, how many times have we seen communication where a man is putting his feet up or is engaged in a conversation with a colleague or a friend who's at home while a woman is in the drama or in the scene doing all the housework, providing the tea, cleaning the house, so on and so forth. Now, while our guidelines don't necessarily say that we cannot feature women as housekeepers or a man as a breadwinner, the issue is when we, through our drama, we tend to insinuate that these characteristics are uniquely associated with one gender, they're only appropriate for a particular gender, these roles, and or only feasible for one gender. And over here, what we really want to encourage is actually showing both men and women sharing household tasks. And what we mean by this is, for example, showing a man, for example, bringing the groceries in and a woman potentially, cooking, or vice versa, where they're both having shared responsibility or both being involved in, cleaning the clothes or doing the laundry, so on and so forth. The second one is about contrast, and there's a significant amount of drama in many of the advertising work and the marketing communication work that actually contrasts stereotypical roles and actually tends to, again, insinuate that one is better than the other. So for example, portrayals where a woman is depicted as, weak or clueless, and a man comes in to kind of save the day. And this is something that, again, tends to reinforce a certain narrative about what a woman is good at and what a man is good at, and therefore contrasts one as better than the other. What we really want to encourage, however, is to show men with the characteristics, with the opposing gender characteristics, right? To show men also as sensitive and show women also as strong as leading. And therefore show the opposite gender stereotypical characteristic that avoids reinforcing specific stereotypes. The third is, there are certain characteristics that tend to be connected more with certain genders. So for example, demonstrating that a man is incapable of childcare, incapable of feeding their child appropriately, incapable of taking care of their child, or incapable of doing housework because, they just can't because they're men. Or, certain things like, women have the inability to do maths, or women have the, are unable to park a car appropriately, or have a good enough sense of direction, is some of these stereotypes that tend to get reinforced in our narratives, saying that men and women are unable to achieve a task because of a gender-related limitation. So what we'd really like to encourage is to show men also as successful in housework as well as childcare. Now, in some of the Zayed University research and some of the other research that we've actually seen, we see that especially in this region, women are actually comfortable, and women and men, male consumers, are very comfortable seeing women in non-stereotypical roles. However, they're not so comfortable with seeing men in non-stereotypical roles. So it's very important to ensure that there is a positive spin on a non-stereotypical role for men. So show men as also doing the housework, show men also as successful as being great parents, is one of the things that we'd like to encourage in terms of depiction of different scenarios. The fourth is that this is a pressure to conform, and usually that is a function of external validation. So, how many times have we seen communication where a woman has, made this amazing spread, of food for a festival or so on and so forth, and then she's done all this hard work, and her success is based on either the husband's approval or the mother-in-law's approval. So while we're not saying is do not show the external validation, but also depict internal validation and self-validation, of a woman's own idea of her own success. The fifth is there's a significant amount of belittling that sometimes happens, right? Especially on both genders for showing emotional vulnerability or showing sensitivity. So for example, a negative portrayal or a humorous portrayal, using humor to show, to disparage a man who is crying or displaying sensitivity, or showing both a woman or a man inept because they're emotional. Especially given the context we are in today and the pandemic and its impact on mental health, it is very important to demonstrate expressing feelings and showing emotional vulnerability as something that is positive. The sixth is belittling men that are carrying out non-stereotypical roles. For example, like being a stay-at-home parent, or in the role of a nurse that you would normally see, being essayed by a woman, and therefore reinforcing this narrative that those roles are less than because they're the roles that are usually performed by the opposite gender. And what we need to encourage more of is to actually depict men in these different kinds of roles. So for example, the role of a man as a nurse, the role of a man as a teacher, the role of a man as a stay-at-home parent, are some of the roles in which we should demonstrate and showcase more in our brand building. The other is appearance, which I talked about as one of the themes. And then again, stereotypical appearances for both men and women. So for a man is a tall, muscular person. For a woman, it could potentially be someone who is fair-skinned and very skinny. And therefore, what we end up demonstrating is, because of the use or the benefit of certain products, is how you would achieve the stereotypical appearance. And what is important over here is to ensure that the ideal appearance is not only the stereotypical one, but ideally encourage the positive depiction of different kinds of appearances that match reality. Importantly over here is that, to show, sort of a before and after, and therefore mock people that don't have an idealized, stereotypical appearance, and, creating significant pressure to conform to an idealized stereotypical appearance is what we want to avoid. 8 is what we recognize is there are certain vulnerable groups that have it even more difficult. For example, mothers of newborns. What we're recommending over here is that to avoid demonstrating that it is that keeping, looking great or bouncing back to shape or looking amazing after childbirth or keeping the house absolutely perfect is a priority over other factors such as emotional well-being. Is one of the things that we have to be very careful of and ensure that we avoid such scenarios that demonstrate that. The 9th and the second last one is contrasting what a child can and cannot do, and therefore restricting their possibilities of future careers, future capability, so on and so forth. So avoiding negative uses of phrases like boys don't, or say that, if boys don't cry, or for saying that a boy runs like a girl and making that be a negative thing is a couple of the things to be particularly mindful of. However, encourage showing that both boys and girls have numerous possibilities in front of them, and demonstrate boys choosing pink, girls choosing cars, and so on and so forth, so that you actually show sort of the opposing narrative. The last is to be careful about reinforcing certain narratives around what is around inclusion and rather exclusion. So for example, explicitly depicting a child of a particular gender being excluded from or being dismissed from an activity because they look different, they're of a different race, they're of a different gender, children not wanting to play with other children because they don't have a stereotypical look, race, or ability, is one of the things that should be avoided, and ensure that we're including inclusive and positive portrayal of different kinds of children. One of the big tips that I can give is, and this is really the litmus test, really, to identify what is a stereotypical piece of communication and what is not, is to actually flip it. So let's say you have a drama that you're looking at in front of you. And if you kind of replace the humor and put a man in a woman's place or a woman in a man's place in the same drama, and you find that it is still funny, it's probably not stereotypical communication. But if you do find that it's not funny anymore when you flip the genders, you recognize that what you have in front of you is potentially stereotypical communication. So that's it from me. These are the 10 guidelines we pulled together to really inspire action and inspire building a different narrative around gender.
Thanks, Ganga, and thanks, Dr. Ali, for a really great view into, the landscape that exists in the GCC. Like you mentioned earlier, we don't really have a lot of data for our part of the region, and the work that you did in driving these insights, like I mentioned earlier, really provided the impetus for us to launch the UAE chapter of the Unstereotype Alliance, and actually took us into the next step, which was the preparation of the guidelines to help direct the advertising and marketing industry on how to unstereotype the work that they plan to do, and which is what Deepa had presented. So I hope for all of our viewers, you got a good insight into the work that the newly formed chapter of the Unstereotype Alliance in the UAE has been doing, the basis of the work that propelled us into the current space. And I hope in the next section, we can provide you with a little more insight into what really happens in the advertising industry and the tech sector. So thank you for watching, and please wait for the second section.